Kecil banget emang. Karena belum apa namanya? Tidak, layar keduanya resolusinya beda gitu loh. Oke, lanjut. Kita langsung aja main. Yes. Ha. Semoga untuk yang sekarang suaranya lebih oke dibanding yang tadi siang. Kalau enggak, gue bingung salahnya di mana gitu. Ini sih udah oke sih harusnya ya. Kalau ini oke, next kita begini terus untuk settingannya. Tidak akan berubah-berubah, tidak apa namanya, tidak material gitu loh. Oke, kita main Dota lagi aja yang lebih istilahnya enjoyable lah kan, dan agak lama gitu. Gue lagi gak mau main GTA dulu, mungkin next pas Kamis sekali. Ya, awalnya sih pengen nyicil kerjaan, cuma apa namanya, udah kagak mood duluan gitu, otak udah capek banget. Tapi kalau masih buat main game mah masih bisa gitu, karena kalau kerja itu kadang-kadang menguras energi kan, menguras energi, waktu dan pikiran gitu loh. Jadi harus butuh waktu yang cukup banyak untuk disisihkan. Oke, kita apa namanya, nge-swap sama relay aja, dan kita akan repick karena keyboardku belum support numpad. Mungkin next akan bisa support gitu. Susah pencet-pencetnya. Kalau udah support sih enak, pakai relay gitu. Pakai tiny aja termasuk susah. Bingung jadi ini. Kemarin pakai dia nih.
For honor, of course.
Coba-coba
A
aja
sound
kalah.
plan.
Juga bodo amat
For
kok.
honor, of course. Certainly.
Apple. Cooldown 14/12. Alah. Degen aura.
Wait till you see me in action.
Yalah.
Justice shall be done.
Justice
A
shall be
sound
done.
plan.
A sound plan.
For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A
Salah-salah
sound
bikin.
plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor.
Seringutan, harus
A
seringutan.
sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Foul. Of course. Feel my wrath. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor.
Let's go.
I'm here to help.
I'm gonna
A
help.
sound plan. For honor.
Let's go.
Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly.
Bad.
For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan.
Ntar. Agak mundurin laptop pun dikit. Bisa gak? Oke, dah.
Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Justice has come. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. For my father the king. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan.
Sabar. Sound plan.
For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly.
Ow.
For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course.
Yan.
Certainly. Of course.
Our brethren's
A
town
sound
is under
plan.
attack.
For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly.
Feel my wrath.
A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. For my father, the king. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Is there danger?
Habiskan mana lo?
For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course.
Notification.
A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course.
Yep.
A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Justice has come. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor.
Our forces are under attack.
First blood.
Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor.
Wow.
Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly.
Betrayer of the light.
Of course. A
Our
sound plan.
brethren's town is under attack.
For honor.
Feel my wrath.
Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For Lord Oran. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of Certainly.
Betrayer of the light. Foul name.
Of course. Certainly. Of course.
For my father, the king.
Lumayan,
For honor.
lumayan jadi Facebook.
Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Certainly. A sound plan.
Sungkil aja
For honor.
gue.
A sound plan.
Wadaw.
Certainly.
Oh itu.
For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound
Balik,
plan.
balik.
For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. I stand for the light.
Sabar dulu makanya.
A sound plan.
Our brethren's town is under
What?
attack.
A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly.
Betrayer of the light.
Of course. For honor.
Our brethren's town is under
A
attack.
sound plan. Of course. For honor.
What?
Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor.
Wih, rame bos.
Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor.
Wah,
Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. 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 Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly.
oi,
Sound
Our brethren's town is under attack.
a sound plan.
sakit.
Justice shall be done.
Justice shall be done.
For honor. Of course.
Tadi
A sound plan.
macam.
Of course.
Wow.
You are past redemption. Justice has come.
Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor.
For my father, the king. Foul knave.
Of course. Certainly. For honor.
Cok.
Certainly. For honor. A sound plan.
A sound plan. Tek.
Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan.
Oh,
I'm here to help. Of course.
salah.
A sound plan. For honor. The light is my strength. For my father. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course.
You are past that.
A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly.
Feel my wrath. Our brethren's
sound
town
plan.
is under attack.
I stand for the light. For honor.
Alah.
Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor.
Alah.
Sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly.
Oh, rame.
Of course. A sound
Our
plan.
brethren's town is under attack.
A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course.
Wait.
For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan.
Cok.
Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course.
Oi.
A sound plan.
Wah, gitulah.
Of course. For honor.
Cak.
A sound
Salah.
plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor.
Take your time. Look around.
Is there danger? Of course.
Oh,
I'm here to help. A sound plan.
mainnya lambat sih
Of
emang.
course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Justice shall be done.
Mana sih dia bikin apa
Certainly.
namanya dagger.
A sound plan. Certainly.
Tok,
A sound plan.
tok. Masih
Certainly.
ya
I wish
2800
only
lagi.
to the light is my strength. A sound plan.
The light is my strength.
Here to help. Certainly.
Emang ada
Is there danger?
pulsa memang dikasih.
Of course. A sound plan. For honor.
Alah, Kak, ngapain?
King. Of course.
Alah,
A sound
kocak.
plan.
You are past
What did it?
Justice shall be done. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan.
Alah,
For honor. A
Honey.
sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course.
Feel my wrath.
sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Of course.
Lah, maju lah.
Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor.
Our brethren's
course.
town is under attack.
For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. For my father the king. Certainly. For honor.
Our forces
Certain.
are under attack.
A sound plan.
Our brethren's
Of course.
town is under attack.
For honor. Certainly.
You are past redemption.
Of course.
For my
What?
father, the king.
Rame banget. Lanjut kan. Ya, pertama kali gue mati main Dota pas lagi live streaming. Alah, ngapain sih? Lalu ini emang
I'm here to help.
tebel banget.
The light
Our
is my
brethren's
strength.
town is under attack.
Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan.
Our brethren's town is
Certain.
under attack.
For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor.
Cok.
Justice shall be done. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor.
Wah. Nah,
For honor.
cok. Terus aja tenang, padahal.
A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan.
Oh,
Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor.
wih,
Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. For
Apa?
honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan.
Bahaya bos.
For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor.
Woi, dia mau hancur aja di
Light
situ.
is my strength.
Hancurin lah.
A sound plan. I stand for the light. Of course. For honor. Of course.
Lagi.
Certainly.
Alah,
For honor. Certainly.
ngapain?
Justice shall be done. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan.
Aduh.
Certainly. For honor.
Betrayer of the light.
Certainly. For honor. Of
Badir.
course. A sound plan. For honor.
Jadi,
I
I stand for the light. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor.
no.
A sound plan. Light.
Our brethren's town under attack.
Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly.
Hello.
Justice shall
Lumayan
be
kan.
done.
Mau gue balik dulu ya. Taruh dulu.
I stand for the light. The light is my strength.
The light is my strength.
Of course. Certainly. Is there danger? Of course.
foul name.
I stand for the light. Certainly. A sound plan. I'm here to help.
Justice has come.
Certainly. A sound plan. The light is my strength. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A
Satu
sound
lagi.
plan. For honor.
Hei,
sound
barang semua.
For honor. Of course. A sound plan.
Ngapain sih?
I stand for the
Gak
light.
jelas.
I'm here to help. Of course. For honor. Is there danger? Of course. I'm here to help. For honor.
Udah jadi. Ah, udah.
Justice shall be done. Of course. For honor.
Biasa, ya jadi.
course.
Style aja langsung.
Sound plan.
Aduh,
Stand for the light. For honor. Certainly. I'm here to help. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly.
Foul name.
Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor.
Wih,
For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan.
ah,
Certainly. For Lord Oran. For honor. Certainly. Of course.
jalannya lambat.
Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor.
Payah nih.
A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor.
Our brethren's
course.
town is under attack.
Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly.
Nice.
Of course. Certainly. Of course.
Our
Certainly.
brethren's town is under attack.
For honor.
Dominating.
A sound plan. For honor. Certainly.
Greetings, my lord.
Is there danger?
Astagfirullah.
Of course.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Serang dong
Shall
ini
be
gue.
done. A sound plan. Of course. I stand for the land. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor.
Mega kill.
A sound plan.
Ah, lu ngapain sih? Yang ngono. Malah yang ngono dulu. Kalah gue. Gak jelas urusannya. Terlalu nafsu.
Killing spree.
Of course. A sound. Certainly. A sound.
Killing spree.
Certainly.
Tuh,
A sound plan.
itu dong.
For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound
Our
plan.
brethren's town is
Of
under
course.
attack.
Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly.
Bye-bye lah.
Is there danger? Of course. A sound plan.
Our brethren's town is
course.
under attack.
A sound Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Light is my strength.
Our
A sound
brethren's
plan.
town is under attack.
Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Poof. I'm here to help. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly.
Dominated.
Of course.
Mega double kill.
A sound plan. Foul
Nggak
man.
ada gua
Of
aja
course.
ini.
Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. I stand for the light. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course.
Gua 12
For
second
honor.
doang, gimana gua
Of
mau
course.
ini.
A sound plan.
Justice has come.
Certainly. Of course. Justice. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly.
Our brethren's town
course.
is under attack.
Certainly. For honor.
Wicked sick.
Of course. For honor.
Our forces are under attack.
Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course.
No.
Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Is there danger? Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan.
Kan?
For honor.
Unbreakable malah.
Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan.
Killing spree.
Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course.
Foul name.
For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course.
Dominating.
A sound. Stand
Semua.
for the light. Here to help. Certainly. A sound plan.
Terlalu kejam gua.
Hello.
What is your wish? I stand for the light. Of course. A sound plan. Of course.
Wah.
Justice shall be done. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course.
Mega kill. Double kill.
Our forces are under attack.
They're dangerous.
Nongkrong ya gitu.
Certainly.
Benar.
A sound plan. I'm here to help. Certainly. For honor. A sound.
Wait till you see me in action.
Welcome to our village.
What news?
Justice shall be done. Of course. For honor. Stand for the light.
Rame kan.
Justice shall be done. Stand for the light. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound Of course. For Lord Rome. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound
Killing spree.
Of course. For honor. Certainly. Justice shall be done. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly.
Kejam gua.
A sound
Kalau jadi menang nanti loh.
for honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound
Unstoppable.
Of course.
Wah, udah menang lah.
Certainly.
Owning dong.
A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor.
Wicked soldier.
For
Balik. Menang dalam waktu 3 menit. Urusannya tinggal kasih itu aja repel. Udah susah emang. Duh, jam berapa ini? Udah jam 8.49. Enaknya ngapain lagi ya? Udahlah, cukup. Baik, ngantuk. Ini sedikit. Oke guys, untuk sesi hari ini sampai sini aja. Ketemu lagi nanti hari Kamis. Aku ada waktu luang untuk live streaming lagi malam. Kalau besok full kerja Senin, Selasa, Rabu. Gitu aja kali ya. Ya sama Sabtu mungkin gak bisa live streaming juga karena memang ada acara di rumah. Minggu kita live streaming lagi. Ya aku usahain di satu hari ini ada ada satu video short TikTok atau Reels gitu aku bikin tiap minggu. Mungkin dari main Dota ini dulu kali sih. Dibikin video Reels. Maksudnya yang portrait gitulah. Kalau misalkan yang landscape mungkin sesekali ketika aku lagi nggak di rumah, ada dinas di Bogor. Jadi aku bikin gitu. Oke. Sampai sini aja dulu. Thank you ya.